Today, as you can see, I'm going to talk briefly about one particular area of cultural exchange between Australia and China, and that is literary exchange. And I know Australians and Chinese have been reading each other's literature and engaging with each other for a very long time, but today I'm just going to focus on the period of the last 40 years. And so that places these remarks within the frame of bilateral relations, the official context, if you like, and the space of cultural diplomacy, which is our subject today. But my larger point, and I hope this becomes clear by the time I finish, is that for it to work, for cultural diplomacy to work, for it to be successful, it requires participation of practitioners of many kinds and on many levels. And really here I'm just echoing what the two previous speakers have said. And in the case of literature, it requires an understanding of the ways that literature happens in these two very different societies. And just to give you one very simple example of that difference, if I speak at a writers' festival in Australia, probably the majority of the audience are about my age. Let's put it like that. Last week, or the week before, I was also in Chengdu, and I did an event at a bookstore in Chengdu where there was an audience of about 100 people. They were all under 40, and most of them were probably under 30. So there's just a demographic difference in the reading culture and the way people behave in the two countries. And that's just one example of how something can be different from what we expect. And what I want to say about the literary exchange between Australia and China over this period, and this is a particular niche area, of course, is that I think it's been very successful. I think it's a positive example of cultural relations. And really that's because it's about mobilizing and maintaining networks, and that has happened. And let's have one image. This is a kind of an image that is a sign of the success. So you may recognize some of those people. It's the launch of the novel Carpentaria by Alexis Wright, award-winning Indigenous Australian author, translated into Chinese and published in Beijing and launched at the Australian Embassy. So on the left you see the Australian ambassador at the time, Francis Adamson, who is now the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Next to her you see Li Yao, the translator of the novel. Next to him you see Tianning, the Chinese writer who was then president of the Chinese Writers Association. And next to her you see Mo Yan, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2012 and spoke at the launch. He had actually met Alexis Wright earlier in Sydney at an event that Western Sydney University helped organise. But let me start by going back a bit in time and situating myself briefly in this continuum. After studying Chinese part-time at what was then the Canberra College of Advanced Education, I made a plan to spend a year in China teaching and writing. And with the help of Jocelyn, who was then the director of the Australia-China Council, and through her Professor Wen Jung, who was the director of a new Australian Studies Centre at Beijing Foreign Studies University, arrangements were made for me to spend a year in China in 1986, first teaching in Beijing, and then followed by a further period teaching Shanghai in 1987 at East China Normal University's new Australian Studies Centre, directed by Professor Huang Shen. As a writer, I was also a guest of the Chinese Writers Association and was able to meet many Chinese writers in those years. The Chinese Writers Association came under the Ministry of Culture. And so through that work, I got to know the two ministries, culture and education, that I would subsequently work with when I was appointed Cultural Councillor at the Australian Embassy at the end of 1987. It was an enthusiastic time in Australia-China cultural relations on both sides, and I was able to build on more than a decade of work by a number of people, again including my predecessor, cultural councillors, Jocelyn among them. And although I had a lot to learn, I had the advantage that the foundational architecture of the cultural relationship had been put in place. The principle of reciprocity and mutual benefit was established. A Chinese concept, perhaps, but one interpreted by the Australian side to mean that things had to go in both directions. That what was possible in one direction should be possible in the other direction, and that what happened should be positive for those involved and should contribute to a larger good by building enduring relationships and institutional links and developing understanding, even familiarity, within the relevant constituencies and the public. And I'm really, again, just echoing what the two previous speakers have said about mutual understanding as the core of cultural exchange. Initially, the educational relationship was folded into the cultural program, and the Australia-China Council assisted with both. But from the start, literary exchange was on the agenda. The first delegation of writers from the People's Republic of China to visit Australia came to Adelaide Writers' Week in 1980. It included the poet, translator and scholar Professor Wang Zuoliang, who wrote warmly about the experience. They met lots of Australian writers. The delegation met Tom Keneally in Sydney for a memorable harbourside lunch. Keneally was back in China last year as part of the Australian Writers' Week there, an initiative now in its 20th year. A return delegation of Australian writers visited China the following year, 1981. By 1987, Beijing Foreign Studies University's journal, Foreign Literature, had put out a special Australian issue that included stories in translation by Frank Morehouse and Helen Garner, and Jack Hibbert's play, A Stretch of the Imagination, the first Australian play performed in China. A steady stream of translation and publishing has continued since then, flowing in both directions. Really too many to even count. And some of this is forming part of a research project that I'm involved in here with colleagues at Western Sydney University called Antiquity in China, part of the larger project Other Worlds, Forms of World Literature. There have been translations of novels by Gail Jones, J.M. Coetzee, David Foster, and Christina Stead, among many others. Non-fiction by Robert Hughes, Jermaine Greer, and Eric Rolls, and Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence by Horace Pilkington, to name just a few. And of course, poetry of all kinds. There's a long list of translations published in the Journal of the Oceanian Literature Research Unit at Birthday University in Anhui. And Professor Huang Shen, the founding director of the Centre at East China Normal University and author of A History of Australian Literature, has produced translations of many classics. That's a photograph of the 10-volume translation series by Li Yao, who we saw earlier. It includes Carpentaria and various other titles. The exchange has continued in the other direction too, with Chinese writers such as Ding Ling. I met her in Canberra in 1984, I think it was. Wang Meng, who became Minister of Culture for a time. Wang Yi from Shanghai. Mo Yan, we've seen Alai, Yu Hua, Bei Dao, Xi Chuan, and the science fiction writer Liu Cixin have all visited Australia. The speculative fiction writer Hao Jingfang spoke here last year. 3 contemporary Chinese women writers appeared with the Jaipur Literary Festival at OzAsia in Adelaide 10 days ago. That's the cover of the journal from the from Anhui, Australian Oceanic Literature Research Centre. That's the first issue of their journal. And you can see Australia and the Australian flag on the boat there. Oops. At the same time, Australians have been active translators of Chinese literature. The classics, Simon Leys translated the Analects of Confucius and John Minford, the I Ching, among other things, but also contemporary Chinese literature. Bonnie McDougall was the first person to translate the Chinese poet Bei Dao into English. Mabel Lee has translated Gaussian Chen, Yang Lien. Jeremy Barmay translated Yang Jiang's 6 chapters of A Carter School Life, and there's much more. As cultural counsellor, I was able to help with some of those activities. One of my tasks was to organise the first Australian Studies Conference in China, held at Beijing Foreign Studies University in 1988. You may recognise some of the faces there. There are quite a few writers, including Wang Zuoliang, I've just mentioned down in the front row, second from the left, Donald Horn in the middle, who was there as chairman of the Australian Council at the time. There are now 35 active Australian studies centres in China, and as Ian has said, one of the newest centres at Sichuan Normal University in Chengdu hosted the annual conference of the Foundation for Australian Studies in China in Chengdu 2 weeks ago. At that conference, there were perhaps a dozen presentations on literature. At the biannual Australian Studies in China conference, that's a different one, hosted by Beijing Foreign Studies University in June this year, there were even more papers on literature. And at the annual conference in Melbourne last year of the Association for the Study of Australian Literature, there were some 30 presentations by visiting Chinese scholars under the theme China and Australia looking in, looking out. So I think it's pretty clear that literature has proven to be an expansive area of exchange. It's cultural, but it's also educational and it's economic. A close relationship has developed between China's Australian studies scholars and the translation and publication of Australian books in China, in parallel to exchanges between Chinese and Australian writers and publishers in industry as well as the educational sphere. One example will suffice, and that's Professor Li Yao. You can see him here. He's in the back row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 from the left with the dark glasses on. That's when he was an emerging translator from Inner Mongolia, working with Wu Zhong, translating Patrick White. He's now become the senior translator, and his achievement was celebrated here at Western Sydney University earlier this year with the publication of these 10 volumes that include works by authors such as Peter Carey, Thomas Keneally, and of course Alexis Wright. So, if literary exchange is one of the success stories of Australia-China cultural exchange over a 40-year period. Why? One cause, as I see it, is that many individuals have been invested in it for a variety of reasons. It has suited both countries. It's met a need in both societies. Australia has continued to prime the pump, and China too has maintained a strong commitment over all this time. In 2010, we here at the Writing and Society Research Centre at Western Sydney got a call from the cultural officer at the Chinese consulate in Sydney. My colleague Ivan Indig is here and he'll remember this. To raise the possibility that the Writing and Society Research Centre might receive 10 writers from China to engage in dialogue with Australian writers, their expenses paid for by the Chinese side. This invitation came at a time when arts funding in Australia for such things was depleted, and there was a degree of fatigue about exchanges with China. Yet it has led to a biannual literary exchange forum between Western Sydney University and the Chinese Writers Association, now heading into its 10th year and bearing fruit in abundance. As a former cultural counsellor who is also a writer with connections to the Chinese literary world, I've been very pleased to be part of all this, largely by being a contact point, a source of advice, and really just by hanging in and staying interested. So if any of you here are thinking of engaging in cultural diplomacy or taking a course in cultural diplomacy or becoming cultural diplomats, I urge you to do so and to be aware of the kind of commitment of time and of networks that is required. Sometimes there's a disconnect between official and unofficial in Chinese society and in the arts. People on both sides, readers, audiences, consumers, want to know what's really going on and want to make their own minds up. People to people remains a fundamental dimension of cultural exchange. And that means engaging with the many different groups, organisations and structures through which things happen. In literature, that's never straightforward because reading and writing are both cultural expression and an industry, a form of exchange that is also business. It's complicated by the fact that translation is always involved, often without being fully recognised. There are things that professionals and practitioners on both sides need to get used to. So, in being involved in this myself, I've had to work with writers, editors, publishers, translators, funding bodies, funding arrangements, agents, contracts, festivals, writers' centres, universities, venues, community associations, booksellers, bookshops, journalists, social media, and governments at national, state, and local levels in 2 countries. So it's a rich field. But these are the fascinating networks that, as a cultural fixer, you get involved with over the years. As was said earlier in answer to a question, the results are very hard to When a book is published, it has its own life, sometimes over many years. And it's very hard to know what the impact of all that is. At this same conference in Chengdu 2 weeks ago, I was amazed to see a copy of one of my own novels that was translated and published in China in 1990, that had been bought from an online second-hand book site in China and had formerly been a library copy. I had not seen that book for nearly 30 years, and somehow it had surfaced. There's greater familiarity between China and Australia now than there was 40 years ago, and there are some new problems. My colleague Carrillo Gantner, you saw him there with the fruit fly circus, he has suggested that in many ways Australian cultural engagement with China has gone backwards. His complaint is directed mainly at Australia's political and cultural leadership. Against that can be set the enormously expanded number of Chinese people who are now in Australia as citizens and permanent residents, as students and as temporary visitors or tourists, and the frequency of Australian travel to China for study, for work, for tourism, for family reunion. Not to mention the massive trade and investment relationship. And I think the larger recognition of Chinese Australians as part of the Australian story, going back to the 19th century and beyond, connecting this country to the wider Chinese diaspora and the greater Chinese world. Yet for the full potential of the relationship to be realised, including the relationship within Australia between Chinese Australia and the wider community, mutual understanding is more important than ever. If problems are to be averted, it's crucial. And my impression is that we fall some way short. And I listened to the conversation about China in the media, at the backyard barbecue. I'm struck by a deficit of understanding even about basic things. Similarly, in the WeChat world, in which many Chinese in Australia operate, there are times when it looks like an alternative reality. Learning how to read each other is something to work at. Being able to read each other's books is a start. To know what people are thinking about can be very helpful. I continue to learn, or I try, as anyone must do who engages with changing China. I've learned to understand that literature means something different and operates differently in different cultures, but at the same time is capable of reaching across those apparent boundaries. It's through the relationships on both sides that mutual understanding and mutual benefit are achieved. Yet it always remains a work in progress. And here are some more photos of writers and translators meeting. John Katsita Moyen and Li Yao in Beijing in 2013. Alexis Wright, Arlai, and again the ubiquitous translator more recently. And that's from OzAsia in Adelaide last year, the Writing China program with Hajik Fang from Beijing, Dorothy Tse from Hong Kong, and Judy Ko from Australia, and Lian Lo as the moderator. So that's my cultural council.
We have some time for our questions.
I have a question for the audience. Because you may have noticed that some of us have been talking about mutual understanding.
Yeah.
But in the definition of public diplomacy coming from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, national interest is the priority. Are they the same thing? Is mutual understanding in the national interest? Is it a national interest? Or are they separate? Is one larger than the other? I don't mean to embarrass you, but you can think about that when you write your essays.
Yeah.
Do I need to use the microphone? I think I can speak loudly. It was really, thank you very much for your presentation. But I was wanting to know, that example that you gave towards the end about, I think you said it was Chinese government money that had enabled Chinese writers to come to Australia. Is it the case, though, that a lot of these exchanges between Australian and Chinese writers, it seems to be driven by the writers themselves, and the money, the governmental money, is coming in to support those initiatives that are driven by the practitioners? Is that what you're sort of saying, or is it a combination of
To an extent, I think nothing happens without money. And even if the writers themselves are sort of ready, willing and able, it's don't happen without money. So there do need to be structures, and you do need to matchmake to get things to happen. I suppose when we got that phone call in 2010, what was striking about that was that in the earlier times, Australia had the money to spend on these cultural exchanges. In China, the resources were much more limited. And even in the 80s, when the reform period was happening, the arts and cultural organisations in China had very tough times. They didn't have money to send people to Australia with necessarily. But that has really changed now. And the Chinese cultural organisations do have money and do want to engage. And they are open to seeking advice, making introductions, working out how best to do it. So there's a kind of there is a matchmaking process, and there is a not always very simple process of finding the writers, the artists, the performers who have most to gain from this kind of experience, and to matching them with the context. So the OzAsia is an interesting example because they really wanted to target emerging writers, new writers from the Chinese world. And fortunately, it was possible to patch the funding together. I can't remember exactly how it happened, but it wasn't all from one source. And that was last year. This year they built on it under their own momentum. But again, funding has come from both Australia and China to bring those three women here.
Thanks, Professor Jules. Since you've mentioned OzAsia, I'm just wondering, because promoting Chinese culture has already been quite, it's already complicated enough, but how would they actually ensure, or when OzAsia or other film or arts festival try to ensure that they acknowledge the cultural diversity within Chinese culture? They do have such kind of
Look, I'm sure they're aware of that challenge. It's not always easy for them to do everything they want. And a festival context like that, OzAsia is a relatively small festival in a fairly concentrated period of time. So they can guarantee an audience for almost anything they bring. The audience trusts them and will go along out of curiosity, if only that. So that's quite a good way to start. I'm not sure what you're thinking of when you talk about the diversity of Chinese
So they
culture.
usually include like Hong
Yeah,
Kong.
well, in the case of Hong Kong, the Arts Council has been a funding partner for OzAsia Festival for some time. So there is a direct and separate Hong Kong involvement in what happens at OzAsia, as there is from Taiwan and Singapore and other parts of the region.
One
So,
of the problems we found with the Sydney Writers' Festival is that they only want to deal with authors who speak English and who are published in English. So it's very hard to cover that diversity that Dr. Chu is speaking
Yes,
about.
well, you're absolutely right about that, and it's very, very annoying. That's all I can say, because it's not difficult to include a translator or an interpreter. It's not difficult to get work available in English in advance for people to see. It just requires a bit more effort. But in my experience, when it happens, the audience loves it. You know, they love to hear the other language spoken, as long as it's interpreted. We should be comfortable with that. It's not that hard. And I think it's a positive area that these writers' festivals, mainstream writers' festivals, certainly need to look into. And this is not only about writers from China, they're the same about a writer from Germany or Spain or wherever it is, if they don't speak English, you know, it complicates things.
Okay. So yeah, thank you very much, Nick.